Hi, and welcome back. This is Art 111 Introduction to Visual Art. I am Shelby Shea, your professor, and today we are going to focus on art materials, mediums, supports, and techniques, and any tools that go along with that. So as we begin thinking about these things, start thinking about what can you create art on. So for instance, in this image behind my face, there is a piece of artwork that has been created on glass windows. Start thinking about what mediums you can use. This might be traditional art materials or things that might be kind of out of the ordinary. For instance, dyeing paper or painting with coffee or beets or other materials. And then thinking about those supports, that's what we're creating the art on. Like we talked about the glass windows, cardboard, recycled objects. And then what techniques are we using? Are the techniques being informed by our heritage, by our culture, by specific training we've had, or images that we've seen of traditional techniques? Or are the techniques something that we have kind of been created ourselves or made up as we go because of resources available to us? So those are all things to consider when we're thinking about where did this technique come from. All right, so we are going to be looking at a lot of choices that artists make this week and talking about those. And there's a lot of choices that have already went into the creative process, but we're going to be kind of focusing on those. And as we look at art this week, we're going to see lots of different artists working in lots of different mediums. This artist, Susan Point, works in a variety of mediums: photography, woodworking, and this specifically are all these individual woodworking pieces that are absolutely stunning, that she has used acrylic paint and wood stain to create a variety of colors to represent the salmon spawning run. And Susan Point, if you click on the image, there's more information about her. She is a Native American, a native artist in British Columbia, and has some really stunning work. So definitely check her out. So we have our big idea recap. These are from all of the weeks we've done so far, everything from our art elements and principles to learning about being an art spectator to being a participant in the creative process and in different thinking processes such as divergent and convergent thinking, and then also considering how heritage, culture, empowerment, and representation can be infused into our artworks. Last week, we began looking at materials and techniques and what artists are using and how they're kind of connecting their ideas to those materials. And this week, we're going to be taking that a step further. All right, so from last week, this should look familiar. Oops, sorry. So this is the same information. We talked about supports, what that might be. It could be everything from what you're painting on top of or drawing on top of to what you're building a sculpture out of. And we talked about different mediums, the materials that you make the work out of. So whether that's fabric, thread, charcoal, recycled materials, clay, the limitations are endless. So we're also talking about techniques, and we a little bit touched on this last week. We talked about how every single medium has multiple techniques the artist can use to work with it, to manipulate those materials. And this week, we're going to dive deeper. All right, so this module really focuses on materials choices. As an artist, you get to make so many decisions. So one of the decisions we've practiced is our composition layout. We practice that through our thumbnailing. Remember, the thumbnails are like the 4 to 6 different images that you are practicing laying out that composition. So are you creating balanced symmetrical composition, a radial composition, an asymmetrical composition, all of those things. So that's one of the first choices you get to make is your composition layout. Then the second choice you get to make is, also the other choice with that is what are you making artwork of, right? What is the content, the idea? And then after you've chosen that composition layout, then the next thing you get to choose is what support and medium will you be using? Meaning, what are you making the artwork on or out of? And then what materials will you be like integrating into that process? And then you get to pick out the techniques. How will you apply paint? How will you apply charcoal? And then what tools are you using along with those techniques? All right. Materials also can limit what is physically possible. So, for instance, if you're working with clay, there's only so much you can physically do to manipulate it at different stages of its drying before it has to be fired. There's also like limitations of paint drying, limitations of how permanent is paint. Is it going to be out in the rain? If it's going to be out in the rain in a sculpture, then you can't have watercolor paint because it's water soluble. So our materials choices are going to take a little bit more forethought, right? The materials you choose can also allude to your message, purpose, and the resources available to you in your location, time period, environment, and the techniques and or material can also reflect cultures and heritages. For instance, if you are creating artwork out of plants or materials that are very like plentiful in your location, that is going to make a lot more sense. If I am an artist here in North Carolina, I might not be making a lot of projects out of bamboo because it's not something I have plentiful in my, yard, right? But one of the things that we do have in North Carolina that is very rare and different than other parts of the country is that we have a lot of magnolia trees, right? We have cotton, we have like all these different plants that I might not be able to access somewhere else in the country. So those might be things that you could help perpetuate your message or purpose, is the resources available in your location or time period. Now, time period meaning when we look at other art as a spectator, we can kind of glean like, oh, they were using acrylic paint. This was one of the first times that acrylic paint was manufactured, right? We can look at other time periods like Impressionism, and we can begin to see um, a plentiful use of multiple types of blues and yellows and greens. And the reason is that for the first time ever, oil paint was being manufactured in a factory, meaning it was put into tubes and now it was portable. And so plein air painting, which was when artists began going outside during Impressionist period, was spurred by the Industrial Revolution. They now had access to paint in tubes that was shelf stable, meaning it wasn't going to rot if you took it outside into the heat or into the sun. And so artists had a lot more flexibility and availability of going out into their environment and using these new ready, full, available materials to create artwork. Before that, before oil paint was manufactured in a factory in a tube, artists had to grind down pigment, and they also had to take oil and mix it in and then store it somehow. And one of the storage methods at one point in time was to store it in a pig's bladder or cow's bladder. So it had animal bladders to then store the oil-based pigment mixture that you had created so that it wouldn't go rancid, and it had to stay in a dark, cool corner of your house, right? So that was very limiting to artists being able to go out into the field and paint in the field. Instead, they had to go out and draw with charcoal or pastel or something else shelf stable and then take it back to their studio and begin painting. So you can see how materials and those resources available can kind of give the viewer an idea of what is your time period that the artist is living in, that the artist is creating in, possibly where their location is, based on what kind of things are available. And then it also can help us reflect on cultures and heritages. For instance, if you were trained in a traditional technique in a certain way, you might be able to notice that through the artist's choices of materials, supports, and mediums. As we dive deeper into some artistic processes and techniques that you began researching last week, remember you made that research matrix, like that spreadsheet that had different information in it, artists you were looking at. Now I want you to consider using one of those artists or multiple of those artists' techniques and materials to inspire your own work. Now, you might say, Prof. Shay, I really, really was researching this awesome way of printing on fabric and weaving, but like I don't have the materials to do that. So that's okay, because maybe you have a take on that that is more applicable to your location, your time period, your environment, right? So for instance, over here, there's an example of taking the designs and the colors and the patterns of kente cloth and then actually like weaving paper together and stamping paper to create those, to kind of come up with that style, to create a visual representation of the technique that would have been done with fabrics and ink and wax and different things like that, right? So as we dive deeper into some of these artistic processes, part of that is going to be figuring out how we as artists in our environment can recreate a similar technique. All right, so our objectives this week are to synthesize your research of an artist by composing your own original artwork based on their influence, moving from spectator back to participant. Okay, then you are going to communicate your creative process from conception to completion, showing creative thinking and problem solving along the way. We are going to do this week's assignment. This weekly assignment will be done via a slideshow to document every step of your process. Next, we will analyze your aesthetic successes and challenges in your original artworks. This will be done at the end of the week at the end of week 8 in a written reflection, as well as kind of touched upon in our discussion post this week and next week. All right. We will be experimenting with and considering how supports, mediums, techniques, and tools perpetuate your creation process and message of your work. Instead of just trying something once and being like, okay, this is what we're going with, we are going to experiment with multiple ways, multiple solutions, right? Multiple solutions that we're then going to choose from to create our piece of work. By the end of this module, you will be able to demonstrate and explain substantial knowledge of an art technique's application, meaning you are going to experiment and practice something, but then you will be able to explain it to others and give steps of how to recreate an art technique as if you are teaching it yourself. I do need to speak about, well, let me go back. Well, on the right here, you see some artwork by artist Nick Cave. He is a phenomenal living artist. He works with sculptures, kinetic sculptures, all kinds of different things. And I love his interplay of light and shadow in all of his work. This piece is called Sound Suit. He made this in 2007. It is currently on display at the Mint Museum. It has some beautiful, at the Uptown location. It has some really, really moving historical commentary and purpose in his message. So take a look at Nick Cave's work if that interests you, and consider maybe for this project experimenting with working three-dimensional. What other three-dimensional things can you create? I saw some really great work last week from some students where they're working on sculpting out of paper. And so, think about any of these materials you could be using in a three-dimensional way as well. All right. So module 7, here's some big questions. As you look at a work or an artist's body of work, ask, how did they make this? What materials did they use? Was this a traditional technique or tools used? Or did they come up with their own take on how to use materials? On the right here, you'll see some examples of batik, which is a fabric dyeing process that utilizes wax and then dyes, and then you remove wax and you add more wax and you add all these layers of dyes and color, and it's absolutely stunning. But the question is, could you do this with materials you have now? I've seen people who kind of do a modern take on batik where they utilize hot glue gun or wax in a glue gun instead of in the traditional like pipette kind of situation. It's like a pipe that you light to melt. You hold over a candle to melt the wax in here, and then the wax comes through this little tiny needle at the end, which is very difficult to control and to kind of keep that wax warm enough to melt and then also small enough to draw with. So it takes a lot of practice to work very well with this technique. But there's lots of other ways and other methods to try this. Even some people do like a version with Elmer's glue on paper or on cloth. Thinking about how did the artist do this, but then also how can I recreate this on my own? All right, so what if your inspiration is a drawing or a painting? Then what will you be researching? That's a great question. So drawing techniques, there are so many drawing techniques. If you just even search, like if you Google search, let's see if it will let me art techniques. Like you're going to get a ton, right? And then you can click on any of these and you can be led to further information, videos, websites, how-tos. So that's the kind of thing that we're looking at is, if you are doing a drawing, what drawing techniques specifically are you going to employ? So I made a list here of a whole bunch of drawing techniques. All of these images link to either videos or more ideas. And then think about the materials that you're using. Are you just using a pencil? What kind of pencil? Meaning, like, is the lead soft or hard? Is it an H, a 2H, a B? Are you using pen? What color? Is it water soluble? If you add water to it, does it move or does it turn a different color? Are you using permanent marker like Sharpie? Are you manipulating that with other materials like rubbing alcohol or hand sanitizer that will make it melt or bleed? Are you using colored pencil, charcoal, ink, graphite sticks, oil pastel? There are so many options with drawing. So we are going to be practicing drawing techniques. If drawing is what your artist has inspired you to do, then you will be experimenting with that this week. If you are experimenting with painting, all right, you're going to be trying out different painting techniques. Experimenting with wet on wet, dry brush, impasto, stenciling, stamping. And there are different sets of techniques for every medium. So if you look up watercolor techniques or acrylic techniques or tempera techniques, you are going to find lots and lots of information. And some of it is linked here. And those are just some. Like I'm sure there's much better even videos on YouTube or websites that kind of walk you through that. I know this link over here on the bottom right is actually 75 different techniques of ways to use paint. So lots and lots of options. Nobody's are going to look the same, and that is what we are hoping for. But remember, you can paint with lots of different things, even natural pigments or items from your kitchen. But there's a whole list here. And then think about, what are you painting with? What's your tool? It doesn't have to be a brush. It could be palette knives or found objects or a fork from your kitchen. Lots and lots of things that you can paint with and create different marks with. So in this week's discussion post, you are going to share with us what support, mediums, techniques, and tools you are considering using and how it perpetuates a message you wish to communicate. Tell us what interests you about these materials and their significance. Also, share any challenges you are anticipating, if any, substitutions of materials you might make in case of other limitations. Consider what you might experiment with when using these materials, and this might fluctuate with further research, but it is very important this week. I would highly suggest reading through the discussion post directions and the assignment directions before you begin your discussion post. All right. You will be responding to 2 peers this week, as usual. Make sure you are asking one question to each peer that you are still wondering about someone's materials, or offer an idea of something else they could consider including or using. Maybe something that you found in the past works really well for you. In the art example over here, in the discussion post on Blackboard, I gave an example of an initial post, right? And my initial post is actually about this piece of work on the pink one. And if you click on that, that's a video of someone walking past it. And then this is its like kind of sister artwork, the blue one. So you can learn a little bit more of those through my initial post example. So I'm not going to talk about it a lot here. And then this week's assignment, okay, Module 7 assignment, is to look at last week's assignment, all those artists that you researched, and use this as an inspiration for creating a new piece of artwork. Disclaimer, you are not creating the piece of artwork this week. That will be due at next week, Module 8, okay? The end of next week. I do need you to think about what you want to create. You will show your thinking through documentation of the creative process. So we've done this before, okay? So everything on this slide is something we've already practiced. Everything on the next slide is something new, okay? And so the directions continue. Okay, so first of all, brainstorm. You're going to show your brainstorm of your idea. Secondly, you are going to create thumbnails. You need 6 thumbnails. Okay, six thumbnail designs. That is where you are showing your composition layout with different various types of balance, all of that. Then you are going to pick your support. You're going to show, each of these is a new slide. So on slide 1, you're going to show an image of your brainstorm process. Okay, if that was on paper, if that was on the computer, wherever that was done. Slide 2, you're going to show thumbnails, your 6 thumbnails. Slide 3, you're going to show a picture of what you are using as a support. If you are using a guitar to paint on, and that is your support, I need to see a picture of it on your slideshow. If you are using canvas, if you are using an old frame, if you are using a random paint palette that's laying around, whatever it is that you are painting on, creating artwork on, sculpting, and using as a base, we need to see a picture of that support along with an explanation of why you chose it. Then we need you to pick your mediums. So you can show us your mediums. Let me see if I have anything lying around here. I think it's a little bit farther away. But if you're using acrylic paint, show the acrylic paints you're using. Show the colors you have. Show the colored pencils you used. If you used whatever it is you use, set them all in a location and take a picture of them. And then put it on your slideshow and tell us why you used why you use those. Why did you choose those? Explain your purpose there. And then pick your techniques and tools. Okay, so show us the tools you used if it's additional to the mediums. So maybe the mediums is, a bunch of acrylic paint, some sand, and some other things. And then maybe the tools, maybe you actually like drew with a seashell or painted or scraped away paint with a seashell, a random plastic knife because you didn't have a palette knife. And then, and then some brushes, right? But then also maybe show either an image of your technique of you trying something, or show like if there's a link, a video, a how-to guide, something that shows us the technique you're planning on using, okay, or that you're experimenting with. And then here's the big part that's new. You are going to find 3 references that demonstrate how to use the technique or mediums you are working with. This should be additional to any research you have already done. Okay, it may be from other artists, it may be from like a how-to video, whatever it is. But this is additional to what you have already researched. So even if your artist is, let's say your living artist doesn't have anything about their technique, but it says they use impasto acrylic paint. Okay, you can search impasto acrylic paint techniques and see how other people are doing that. And then you would be able to infer that they are using similar techniques, correct? So then you can find 3 references about that and include that on a slide. Okay, once you've kind of collected all of these materials and tools and you have an idea of how, ways that these techniques can be applied based on your research, then you are going to demonstrate 3 test or trial runs of the technique, mediums, tools. Like this is your experiment, all right? Your experiments can be, it doesn't have to be like the final product, okay? So here's an example of experimenting with watercolor, okay? And the watercolor was applied to the page, or actually water was applied to the page first. And then a wet on wet technique was used where paint was just dropped in and allowed to kind of mingle in the areas. And then the lines that you might be able to see on this that create this really interesting texture was created by taking saran wrap and just pressing it on top and letting it dry, and then peeling it off when it was done. So the idea here being, this is an example of an experimentation page, right? This is just experimenting with materials. And so this is one experimentation, all right? And then you would have 2 more showing ways to experiment with that material, all right? This week, you are not creating the final project. You are spending your time with experimenting with the materials and the tools, okay? Each trial, each experiment should have its own slide and a description that includes what worked well and what was a challenge. Think of this as experimenting with materials and how they work together. So for instance, a description of this might be that the saran wrap did not work as well in the area where it was pulled off before it dried, but it showed up like much more in detail where it was allowed to dry altogether and then the saran wrap was peeled off later, or where there was more pigment also applied and like up here it was a little more watered out, right? So somehow explaining what worked well and what was a challenge about it. Okay. That is your goal this week, to experiment with the materials, to try incorporating different things. Now, you might not, I will be honest, you might not even be able to create this slide about picking your techniques and tools all the way until you are done with your experiments. Because, for instance, you might just think, okay, I'm using a brush and I'm using watercolor and I have like a couple things in here, but maybe when you go grab that piece of recycled saran wrap, then you're like, oh, that's another tool, right? That's another way to manipulate the material. So just thinking about those things as you're working, being open to experimenting with materials, open to trying new things, applying, whatever you have to make it as interesting as possible. So as we move forward, that is pretty much it for this week. Make sure that if you are applying for the Answer Scholarship, remember that deadline is coming up next week. It is due March 1st. Please, please, please remember you always have access to YouWill, which is our teletherapy. So you can call in and have an appointment with a therapist based on your preferences and needs. And last but not least, if you have questions, reach out. My office hours on Zoom are through Blackboard, Tuesdays 7 to 7:45, Friday mornings 8:30 to 9:30, or request a time and we can meet. I can answer questions or emails at any time. I hope you guys have a fantastic week and have fun with your experimentation of materials. And I think you guys are going to enjoy what we're heading up to. I know this is our second to last week. So next week we will be working towards creating our final projects. Please do not jump ahead on that because it might force you to have to restart. So this week, just worrying about materials, supports, mediums, experimenting with techniques and tools. All right. Have a good week.